Here we have an image shot with a Canon R5 mirrorless camera along with the Canon RF 100 to 500mm lens, and the lens was set at the maximum 500mm focal length. The sophisticated image stabilization of the Canon R5 and the lens was turned off, and I needed an aperture of f/25 with an ISO of 100 to take the shutter speed right down to a 1/15 of a second. The idea, of course, was to pan with the subject to create movement that affects every part of the image. Here we're viewing the original image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw. So global editing first of the entire image, and we're going to begin with a severe crop and rotation. So selecting the crop tool, I want to make a slideshow using some of these images with movement, and I want them to be 16:9 in aspect ratio. So I'm going to select that, but I'm going to make quite a tight crop. I'm also going to rotate this to give it a nice angle. I'm going to bring it in so I've got a great composition here, strong point here, here, and here, and a diagonal too. I'm going to hit the Enter key to commit that change. So hopefully I've got some good composition here and some impact. Now we have cropped in very tight, but the image is blurred, so our normal concerns about doing this sort of cropping is not such an issue. Having said that, let's take a look at the effect of that crop by right-clicking and zooming to at least 100%. In fact, let's go to 200%, and I'll scroll down to where we can see the noise in the water. Even though I've made a tight crop, it's not bad, but I'm going to go down to my Detail tab. I'm going to put a noise reduction in there, probably up somewhere around 30, 35. If I double click and take it off, you can see the noise returns, and if I click, it's doing a good job without going too far. Right click and we can fit the image back in view. Now I'm going to go to my Basic tab, because all I want to do here is hit the Auto button. We're going to use the auto setting here as a starting point. You can see it's moved many of the sliders here, but I'm going to make some changes on top of that. So for a start, I'm going to come down to my whites and my blacks, because if I move my whites to the right, look up at the top right at the histogram, you can see I have to go a long way before I actually burn out detail. So I can increase the contrast here by moving this slider to the right, not too far, not so that that little shape lights up at the top right, and I can do the same with the blacks, although I don't have so far to go. Blacks usually are a little bit more acceptable to the eye, but I'll back off from that so we get the best of all worlds here. A little bit of clarity perhaps, just to give a bit of impact, and I'll have a bit more vibrance because this was quite close to sunset. Now I can't go any further with the global editing without doing damage to one edge, corner or part of the image. So now we need to turn to strategic editing. And what I tend to do there is whatever attracts my attention, I deal with that first. Now I can see some highlights that are a little bit burnt out here on the tip of the surfboard, just under the front as well, and maybe a couple of areas over on the right hand side. So this is where I'm going to turn to masking. Now the mask can be found in the toolbox on the top right, but they all have, or most of them have, shortcuts. The one I want to use is the brush. The shortcut is K on the keyboard. I'm going to select my brush, and I'm going to put in some changes even before I brush onto the picture, because I know what I want to do. I want to take down the highlights a little bit, and I want to take down the exposure a little bit. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller and the image larger. Touch the Control key, click and drag. I can now drop down the size of that brush using the square bracket keys on the keyboard. And now looking up at the right hand side at the flow, you can see the flow is set very low. So I can work in a delicate way here because I just want to brush over these areas just to darken those highlights. Got a bit of a highlight on the man's leg. Let's brush over that. And you can see I'm gradually removing that. Now I'm going to move around the image and just deal with any of these bright areas, but sometimes we need to make the brush a little bigger. Here I can stay with the brush that I have. Maybe down here I can make the brush bigger and we can work over this area. Now these are small areas of highlight, but we're making quite a difference to our image here. At some stage I often hit Ctrl-0 to fit the image back on screen. Gives me a much better view of the image and I can decide what I want to deal with next. So let's go over to the right hand side. We will zoom in a little bit, move it into position. What do I want to deal with? Not quite so much here, just a few highlights which maybe will benefit from a little brushing. But when we get down to the bottom right corner, maybe I can make a big brush because down here it's going to benefit us if we can darken that down quite a bit. And that's going to help push the attention back onto the surfer. Couple of smaller highlights here. Now you can see the changes that I made on the right hand side weren't far off, was they? You get a feel for that after a little bit of use. So don't worry too much if you get this wrong, because we can always adjust either the flow rate or we can back off with the exposure and the highlights. Ctrl-0, it doesn't look too bad to me. So what do I think needs my attention next? The bottom and the bottom left corner. And to do that, I'm going to use a gradient mask. We can do that from the little white cross in the blue circle up in the top right, but much easier to just touch the G key. Then I can click and drag up because that's the sort of area I want to affect. Moving over to my sliders, I'm going to move the sliders now after creating the mask. I'm going to start by just dropping the exposure a little bit. You can see what I want to do here. So I want to make this fairly dark, especially in the bottom left corner, because once again I want to use that as a nice base for the image. But you can see that it tends to make the area just below the surfer a little bit too dark. So maybe I can back off a bit, but I want to put maybe a little bit of blacks, some whites here. So I'm going to take it down darker again and maybe just bring the whites up just to give it a bit more sparkle, but I still get the effect of darkening the bottom corner. But I've overdone this section in the middle. So this is where we can go to subtract from the mask, choose a brush, keep the flow rate fairly low, probably somewhere around 20%. Make the brush a little bit bigger. So now I can just brush over this area and say, well, thanks for that darkening of the left corner and most of the base, but I don't want the full effect of it in that position. Let's take a look at another gradient on the top. Now this one, we can intersect that. Let me demonstrate that by touching the G key. That brings in my linear mask. Click and drag, but now I'm going to affect my surfer. But not if I go back to the mask, from this option here, intersect the mask with the subject. Once that selects, it's going to look a little bit odd because I need to invert my mask. The X key will do that. Now you can see exactly what I have. Let me move this out of the way. I've got the area I want to affect masked, but I'm not encroaching on the surfer. So now I can drop down the exposure. I want to give it a bit more contrast up there. Maybe a little bit more exposure. You can see I've got another area that's going a little bit dark right up at the top left. And even if I wanted to add a little bit more blue in there, I can do that. A lot of these things are going to be purely personal. but a little bit more perhaps. But once again, I've got an issue here where this part is too dark. Well, let's stick these back where they come from. Let's go to Subtract, Brush. Once again, I'll zoom in. The brush is just about the right size now, so I can just brush over these areas just to lift those tones a little bit. Control 0, and you can see it doesn't take too long at all. Now, I think we can do exactly the same on the left-hand side and probably even the right. So G key again, I've just touched. Click and drag. Let's drop down the exposure a little bit. I don't think I need anything else on that. I think that's sufficient. G key again. Click and drag on the right-hand side. I'll drop back a little bit. I'm not too worried about that slight encroachment on the surfer because I don't think I need to make too many changes here. We've got highlights mostly, so we'll drop those down and we'll drop the exposure a little bit. And we've got quite a good effect there. Now I'm just looking around the image now to decide if I'm happy with what I have. Maybe one more thing to do would be to give a little bit of a vignette around the entire image. I'm going to do that with the J key. Remember, all of these masks can be found in the blue circle with the white cross. But it's much easier to just go to what we want using the shortcuts if you can remember them. Here I'll select it from here since I've got the panel open. And if I double click, you can see instantly that I've got an oval filling the entire frame. I can make adjustments to that, but I know from experience that generally it works for me most of the time, but I need that mask inverted. The X key will do that. Now I can go to my exposure and maybe I can just tweak those corners a little bit just to hold this in nicely for the edges and corners so we're pushed into the center of the frame where the surfer is. Now before we leave the Adobe Camera Raw screen, I'm going to go back to the Basic tab because I'm just looking at the color, the final color here. Maybe just a little more if I can tweak a little more. But I'm going to do a little bit of strategic color. Now we can do that here, but I think I'll do this when I get this open up into Photoshop, which I'm going to do now by clicking the Open button. Now remember, whenever we open up an image into Photoshop, what we've done on the raw file will be retained. So if I was to open up Photoshop's bridge, the image as we can see it here still remains. So I could double click that thumbnail if I suddenly change my mind. But I'm reasonably happy with what I have. Generally speaking, in Photoshop, I just do some final tweaks. It could be little splots. That's a good word. I think I'll invent that. Splots. It's a combination of spots and blemishes. And there's always one or two. Not too many here because a lot of them have been created in the effect with the slow shutter speed. But there is one or two. So I would look at the image at this size. I can see a bit of a highlight around the back side of the guy on the board and one or two others. So I would just use the spot healing brush here. Zooming in, and I would just deal with some of these little marks to my satisfaction, and you'll see lots of little highlights. Now you can get carried away with these if you're not careful, so sometimes it's a good idea to just zoom out and take a look at the picture before you start getting carried away with every little highlight. But they do make a difference. But generally speaking, if you deal with the worst of them, and I think there was one or two over here, then that's probably going to be sufficient. But again, this is one of those things which is, I suppose it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? We're going to spend as much time as we feel is appropriate for the quality of the image we're going to end up with. Now, the majority of the changes that I'm making in Photoshop, we could have done those in Adobe Camera Raw. It's just personal preference and the ways we all like to work. I'm going to go over to my toolbox here because I'm going to select my burn tool. I'm going to select highlights from the options above, and I want the exposure to be about 5%. Going to drop down the brush size because I'm just going to do a little bit of burning over the worst of these highlights. Just one or two, not many. You can see it's almost nothing at all. And in fact, I think I've gone a little bit too far down there, so I'll hit Ctrl Z a couple of times to back off. But then I would turn to my sponge tool. That's set to saturate. 10 or 20%, I'll go to 10%. I'll hit Ctrl 0, make sure my image is fully on screen. Just a little bit of enhancement of the green around this area. Maybe around the base, just to bring our attention in and the surfboard. And certainly just bring up the colour of my surfer, because that colour against all of the others is a really good draw on the eye. Not too much. And I think we're just about done. As always with image processing, there are some aspects that can be right or wrong, but also very many aspects of that image editing which contain personal choice. I suppose the most obvious of these is the colour saturation and colour balance, but there are others too. The processing of this image contained no difficulties at all, and it's fairly typical of my workflow these days. Now I say these days because the introduction of Adobe Camera Raw masks this year, which is 2022, has changed the way that I work. Image editing generally evolves, but our aim is always the same. Interesting, well-processed images with as much impact as we can produce. Let me know in the comments below if this style of start to finish video is something that appeals to you, and also consider subscribing to my channel and hitting that thumbs up. It's nice to know if I'm on the right track, but for now, I'll see you next time.